Well, hey everybody, Paul here. I'm so excited to be with you in our last week talking about this tension between confidence and humility. Last week, we've been talking about how do we know our identity. If we know ourselves as children of God, we can be both confident and humble. We know that we don't have to compare ourselves to others because comparison is the thief of joy. We've been looking at this tension through the lens of a person named David, specifically David and his slaying of Goliath. Now, maybe you've heard the story, but I'll tell it again real quick. David was this shepherd boy, youngest son, not a warrior, shouldn't be a warrior. And then we have Goliath, who is this tall, muscular warrior. He's gruesome, he's fearsome. And David said, I'm going to slay Goliath because Israel is my people and he is attacking them. And I know that God will empower me to do so. And so David does. He doesn't take armor. He doesn't take weapons. He takes some stones and a sling. And through that, he was able to slay Goliath, not because he was a great warrior, not because he was a great shot, not because he had a magical sling or magical stones, but because he walked with God, because God was empowering him. And how often we can walk through life thinking that we're either the best and we're prideful, or we're the worst and we're incredibly insecure, but how neither of those says what our identity is. If we know that we are children of God, we can walk in confidence and humility. And as we look at this story of David, I'd actually like to take some time and fast forward a little bit. This week, for our last week, we're not going to look at David slaying Goliath, but we're going to look at some of the consequences. And again, consequences doesn't mean bad. It just means things that happen because of. We're going to look at some of the consequences of this story in two other points in David's life. So we've got David and we've got Saul, who's the king of Israel. And years later, David has become this renowned warrior. He actually does become this incredibly popular figure. And people start to really love David. And Saul becomes incredibly jealous of David. Remember last week how we talked about how comparison was the thief of joy? Well, Saul was comparing himself to David, seeing David as this person that I want to be. But instead of learning from David, instead of celebrating David, instead of working alongside David, he decides to kill David, because David is a threat to his legacy and his power. And so we've got kind of this almost like a war or a battle between Saul and David, David's warriors and Saul's warriors. And they were chasing all around the ancient Near East, and it was this whole thing. But David's running from Saul. And so I'd like to read you this story here. At this point, we've known David as this guy with a stone and a sling, but we actually see David's identity change over time. Now, David had found this man, this prophet of God, and he says, is there no spear or sword available? So he's run from Saul. He says, is there no spear or sword available here? I took neither my sword nor my weapons with me because the king's mission is urgent. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down, is wrapped up in a cloth. If you want it, take it, because there is no other except it here. And so David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. And Saul takes on Goliath's sword, which it sounds pretty cool. I'm going to be honest, when I read this, it sounds like a movie every time. David grows up and begins to use Goliath's sword. David slayed Goliath with a stone and sling, and yet years later, he's using his own sword. Why is this detail important? Why does it matter that David begins to use Goliath's sword? It's because earlier we have this detail where Goliath is talking about how big his sword is and how strong his sword is, and yet David doesn't use a sword. He uses a sling. And why does it matter now? Because David changed and adapted. David responded to the circumstances around him and picked up a new tool, a new thing. A stone and sling were great tools for that specific story, but David doesn't take a stone and sling to fight against Saul. No, he uses this sword. Why does this detail matter? Why does David using Goliath's sword matter? Because earlier it was an important detail that David did not use a sword, and yet Goliath thought that that was his strength. He had a sword, David had a stone and sling, and yet over time, David stopped using his stone and sling and used this big sword. I wonder what it looks like, this huge giant, like out of a video game almost. Why does that matter? Because confidence and humility means adapting and changing and growing. And you guys are in a period of life right now where you are constantly having to change and adapt. Sometimes that change and adapting is bad. Sometimes you've been forced and told that you need to change who you are, you need to blend in, you need to look a certain way, and I'm not saying that. But I also want you guys to know is that sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, change is good. Change means taking on new skills, new abilities, dropping things that didn't work. Confidence and humility means changing what is good to be something even greater. Maybe you've been doing something that's working and it's working really well, but God is calling you to something greater. And that change is scary. And that change is saying, but this thing was working. Why do I need to let go of it? God is saying, because I have so much bigger plans than this. Let me share a personal story, actually. Maybe this will help this analogy. When I was 17, I was serving in the church that I was attending, and I did all the games and like fun stuff for the third, fourth, and fifth graders. I was like the game guy. So every week we had like a small group, we had like we did snacks, but I was the guy who like put together all the games, and they were fun games. Believe it or not, I'm a pretty fun guy, and my games were awesome. But I was in Haiti talking to this Haitian pastor, and he said to me, if you continue to play these games, the devil will eat them up. That's what he said. If you continue to play these games, the devil will eat these children up. And I thought, but why? What's wrong with these games? And he said, because the stakes are so much higher now. These games were great. You've had such a good time playing these games, but if that's all you do, if all you do are creating games and fun times for these kids, but you're not helping them know who Jesus is, they're doomed. And I realized that having fun, playing games was great, but I needed to drop that in order to do so much bigger things. Does that mean that games and fun were bad? No, I still continue to do them, but I had to change and adapt. We often think that confidence means we're no longer changing. Like we're confident in who we are, so we don't have to change anything. But often, sometimes it's the opposite. That confidence can create stubbornness, that we look at ourselves and saying, I'm not willing to change because I'm not confident in something else. Especially for you seniors, I bet that you guys are feeling some anxiety about your new stage of life. Eighth graders as well. We're coming around to the point where we're going to be going into a new school perhaps. And seniors, maybe some of you guys are moving out. Things are going to be changing, and it's actually really scary. And in fact, the next series that we're talking about in May is talking about exactly this. But I want to talk about it a little bit now, if you'll allow me. Sometimes you're feeling really scared. But if you cling to the things that you thought were working because you're afraid to change, that's not living in confidence and humility, and you're actually missing out on so much good things that God has created. I know people who still go to the school that I went to. They've been going to the same school for 8 years because they're afraid to do anything else. That thing that was good, that was helpful, has become their security blanket. God is calling us, and God is changing us for something that is greater. Confidence and humility means allowing yourself to change because you're no longer bound to the person you've been before. Now, sometimes you've been living a life that is great and God is calling you to do greater things, but sometimes God is calling you to greater things because the life you've been living is no longer great. The life that you've been living is not great, and you feel bound to it. You feel like you've invested so much time into living a life that is awful, that made you mean, that made you greedy, that made you living a life that is just awful, and you feel bound to it. God is setting you free from that. Confidence and humility means I no longer have to be the person I've been before. I've got one final story from David, and then we're going to wrap up. We've maybe heard the story of David and Bathsheba. Long story short, I'm going to give it so short. David abused his power. He manipulated these people around him, and he ended up hurting a lot of people. Okay? And we see this. He recognizes what he had done, and he says to his friend Nathan, he said, I have sinned against the Lord. Now Nathan replied, he said, the Lord has taken away your sin. He said, the Lord has forgiven you. He said, but because you've done this, you have shown contempt for the Lord. There are consequences. But at the end of the day, it says this, the Lord loved David. And because the Lord loved him, he sent word through his friend to name his son Jedediah. God loved David despite of what he's done. Maybe you've lived a life where you are ashamed of the things that you've done. You feel like you've been burdened by your mistakes. I want you guys to know this as we go into groups. If you are struggling with confidence, if you're struggling with humility, maybe the first step is forgiving yourself. Maybe the first step is allowing yourself to change. That you've been walking this road of pride and insecurity because you feel so committed to a life that you know isn't worth living. Who you've been isn't who you have to be. And that could be for good or for bad. It could be because the person that you've been has been good, but God is calling you to something greater. But maybe the person you've been, is bad, is wrong. God is freeing you from that. You don't have to be committed to the person that you've been. God is bringing you to so much greater. And when we know the great things that God has called us to be, we can live in confidence and humility. The confidence to know that God is creating us to be someone good, and the humility to know that the place we're in isn't where we need to be, isn't where we should stay. God is constantly bringing us to greater and greater things. As we go to group, guys, I'm excited for the ways that God is changing us. I'm excited for the good things that God is bringing us into. Maybe it means to forgive ourselves. Maybe it means to let go of the things that we think are really good so that we can hold on to something greater. Whatever it is, I invite you guys and encourage you guys to have those conversations. And you know what, guys? I'll see you next time.